Have you ever wondered why crouching makes your rocket jumps go further in TF2? Have you ever wished that you could completely avoid fall damage?
Yeah.
Have you ever wanted to learn a bunch of goofy, wacky tech that you can use to absolutely demolish random children in casual?
We're gonna giggle through
Well, if you wanted all that and more, then you've clearly come to the right place. Today, I wanted to try and demystify TF2's movement, show off some weird glitches and exploits you might not have heard of, and on top of all that, I wanted to try and explain how all of it works. If we're talking about TF2 movement, there's some super basic things to talk about that most people don't even really know exists. So let's quickly talk about rocket jumping. You probably all know what rocket jumping is. You jump, crouch, and you shoot at the floor, roughly all at the same time, and you fly off into the sky. But have you ever wondered why you have to crouch when you rocket jump? It seems weird, right? In the older games that inspired TF2, like Quake for example, rocket jumping is as simple as jumping and shooting your feet. Why does TF2 have this extra little step? Well, the reason for this is actually surprisingly stupid. In TF2, your collision is controlled using your bounding box. This big, clumsy looking rectangle around your character is responsible for everything collision related in the game. When you walk into a wall, your bounding box collides with it. It's also responsible for the hit detection of explosives and projectiles. When you crouch, it gets smaller. When you jump, it lifts off the ground. You get the deal. But there's a hidden property of the bounding box that goes mostly unnoticed and unmentioned by most people. The bounding box also controls the weight of your character. How heavy a character is controlled solely by your character's bounding box. And since the bounding box is the same size for every character, this means that the mass of each character is exactly the same. But the thing about this mass property of the bounding box is that it's not based off of any numbers or behind the scenes stats or anything. All the game does to check the mass of a character is check the size of the bounding box. So when you crouch and your bounding box gets shorter, your character also literally gets lighter. Seriously, this is why you have to crouch when you rocket jump. Crouching makes you weigh less, so your rockets send you further. And this is also true for surfing enemy damage. Crouching and jumping when an enemy shoots at you will cause you to get pushed away much faster than if you just jumped. It's also the reason that one Halloween spell that makes you small makes you take so much knockback. Your bounding box getting smaller literally makes you have less mass. But this isn't the only way that you can make your rocket jumps take you further. There's another method for doing this called a C-tap. C-tapping is a TF2 movement exploit that lets you get more height from any explosive jumping. To perform a C-tap, all you have to do is hold crouch for a short duration, then release it. Then whilst you're in the middle of your unducking animation, you press jump and fire a rocket below your feet. The timing is a little tight because you need to release the crouch button before becoming fully crouched, and you also need to fire the rocket to hit the floor basically the instant you leave the ground. Now this might seem like a random string of button presses, but if we take a look at the player's bounding box when they do a C-tap, you might get a clue on just how this works. Notice how C-tapping reduces your jump height by quite a lot. This is the secret of what a C-tap is actually doing to make you go further. You're literally closer to the ground, meaning you're closer to your rocket's explosion and you get sent further by its knockback. So why does C-tapping make you closer to the floor? Well, the answer is simple. It's sauce spaghetti. Whenever you try to uncrouch, the game does a check to make sure you're able to do so. It checks where your body is going to extend into to make sure that you're not going to like clip into the roof or something. And most of the time, this all works perfectly. But for some reason, if you crouch but then uncrouch before you ever fully became crouch, the game still does this little check to make sure you have room above you to stand up in. But if you jump in the middle of this uncrouching state, the game gets confused. The game incorrectly assumes that you're trying to uncrouch whilst in the air, when in reality, crouching and uncrouching while in the air is supposed to be instantaneous. But because the game thinks you're uncrouching, it checks where your bounding box is going to extend to make sure you have room to uncrouch. When you're on the floor, it checks above you to make sure you can stand up, because that's where your bounding box moves when you uncrouch. But when you're in the air, uncrouching makes your legs stick out downwards. So that's where the game game does this check. The game checks below you and finds the floor, and it concludes that you can't uncrouch right now. So it forces you to stay crouched just like it would if you were in an enclosed space. And being forced into a crouch state while in the air like this makes you very close to the floor. Much closer than could ever be possible by just jumping and crouching. And since you're much closer to the floor, your rockets send you much further than they would do otherwise. Ctapping is a pretty powerful tool. It lets you jump much higher than would be usually possible. It takes some practice, but once you're good at it, it's basically a no-brainer to use it wherever possible. And Ctapping is quite a well-known trick by now. People have known that Ctapping has existed for more than a decade now. So even if you can't do one, you've probably heard of it. But there's one more thing that C-taps can do that, as far as I can tell, pretty much nobody has ever heard of. Because C-tapping has this magical property that literally makes you shorter. Okay, maybe not that much shorter, but it does make you shorter, trust me. Just take a look at this. There's this hole in the wall that I can't walk under, and the hole next to it can't be crouched under either. There's seemingly no way to fit through this gap. Unless, of course, I C-tap precisely 4 times in a row. After doing this, I can fit through both holes with ease, as if there was no issue in the first place. But now, if I jump normally just once and try to walk through again, I don't fit anymore. This might be the goofiest and most niche piece of trivia that I know about TF2, and I only learned about it like a few weeks ago. So how does this work? Well, the answer is obviously sauce spaghetti, but more specifically is that C-tapping doesn't make you shorter, it actually makes you slightly closer to the ground. You see, TF2 has a unit of measurement called a hammer unit, named after the hammer map editor that people have been using to make TF2 maps for the last 16 years. The player's bounding box is 82 hammer units tall. The maximum height you can rocket jump with a C-tap is 691 hammer units directly upwards, and the soldier's walk speed is 240 hammer units per second, because speed is also measured using this unit. And the reason I'm explaining this is because TF2's collision has some slightly janky things associated with it that most people don't know about. Every single object in the entire game that you can collide with secretly has a small little film over it that you collide with instead. Every time you walk up to a wall and press up against it, the game is constantly trying to keep you exactly 0.03125 hammer units away from that wall. The reason the game does this is because of old source games like Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 had some bugs where you could get stuck in walls when playing on an old computer, because old computers weren't very precise with calculating your coordinates or something like that. So the game had this little barrier on every wall to prevent you from actually getting stuck inside the actual wall. But in TF2, this bug doesn't happen anymore. But the small barrier between walls remains as a vestige of the old source games. But this barrier isn't limited to just walls. This also happens on the floor too. And for some really strange reason, every time you C-tap, you start gradually poking through that 0.3125 unit gap. And after 7 C-taps in a row, you will be completely flush with the floor. And thus you are now 0.03125 units shorter than you normally would be. And this is what lets me fit through those holes from earlier. And jumping normally just once resets this and puts you back to your original height like nothing ever happened. Now, this small barrier can be broken on the floor by C-tapping, but it's even easier to break through on the wall. Step 1. Walk up to the wall and hold W. Step 2, do a little wiggle by spamming A and D a little bit, maybe even do a jump for good measure too. You're now past this very small third of a unit barrier. So now look at this hole in the floor. I can't fit through the hole normally, but if I do a little bit of a wiggle here and then randomly smash myself into this wall here, I can suddenly fit through the hole perfectly. Now this might seem like it's, you know, completely pointless, but it actually does have some practical uses in game. Most notably is with something called a pixel walk. Sometimes on maps you get these pesky little invisible walls called clip brushes. They stop you from like jumping out of the map and stuff, and they're pretty good at doing that. But you also get these little sloped ones that push you off of small ledges that the map maker didn't want you to stand on. But if you jump into this ledge and do a little wiggle, pushing past that thin barrier between walls, you can actually stand on this ledge despite the mapper's best intentions of keeping you off of it. And there are lots of these brushes on lots of maps. They don't have to be invisible slopes either. Sometimes real slopes do the trick as well. And the funniest part of this to me is that these ramps don't actually stick out of the wall enough to be stood on normally. The tip of the ramp is actually perfectly flush with the wall. But because of that 0.3125 barrier between you and every object, you can actually stand on the tip of this ramp anyway, because I'm not stood on the tip of the slope, but instead on the tip of that tiny unit barrier that is on top of that slope, which is incredibly ironic if you ask me. But we're actually not done talking about this barrier that walls have, because there's another incredibly niche tech that relies on it called a pixel surf. Pixel surfs are a little different to pixel walks. They occur on tiny little lines that meet like this. These are called brushes. When you make a map for TF2, you do it in the hammer editor, and you place down these blocks called brushes to construct the map with. Where two brushes meet, you get this little seam. On this line is where the pixel surf will occur. None of the brushes stick out, so there's not actually anything to stand on here. But if you jump at just the right height, you can begin hovering where these brushes meet. As long as you keep holding a directional key into the wall, you will stay hovering like this forever. And you can glide backwards and forwards along the line. It's pretty goofy, right? Now you might have noticed that some of my footage of pixel surfs came from Counter-Strike in a video that's about TF2. Well, the tech does work in both games, but the tech is much easier to pull off in Counter-Strike than it is in TF2. The reason why is actually pretty complicated, and a little bit boring too. Something to do with the way maps are compiled or something. But just trust me, because as simple as it might have looked, it is incredibly difficult to pull off, even in Counter-Strike, and it's incredibly rare to see because of this. After learning about this tech and going hunting for footage for it, I could only find 2 good clips of it happening in the wild. One of those clips, funnily enough, comes from a player called Warped, who at the time had no idea what a pixel surf was. So he uploaded this clip to his YouTube channel, and he appropriately named the mysterious tech as the warped bug. Yeah, real subtle, buddy, real subtle. But this elusive warped bug is an example of a pixel surf. These two brushes meet on this line, and he has gotten a perfect lineup to hover along that line indefinitely until he releases the W key. There's also this old clip from a player called Kato, where he fails some wall pogo section, so he shoots himself downwards and accidentally hits the perfect height for a pixel surf. To explain why this works, I first need to explain how TF2 and its servers calculate things. TF2 measures everything from hit detection to collisions to player actions, everything like that in what's called a tick. There are 66 ticks per second on a normal TF2 server. Inside of every tick, the game measures a bunch of stuff, like where you're moving, how fast you're going, whether you're touching anything, stuff like that. Where these two brushes meet on this line, the game is getting tricked into thinking that you're colliding with the top part of this bottom brush. The reason this is so rare is because it doesn't just happen whenever you fly past two brushes meeting. The only time it happens is when you are extremely close to where the brushes meet, the tick before you actually touch it. If you want the specifics, you have to be within 0.01875 and 0.03125 hammer units above this line, the tick before you actually pass it. And just for reference on how precise that is, a single hammer unit is approximately this big. So this is the reason you basically never ever see pixel surfs happening in the game. I've never had one happen to me, and I've only heard of it happening on a small number of occasions to other people. This might just be the rarest glitch in all of TF2. So rare that it's basically random. So if you were looking for the dream of hovering in the air in some funny spot on a pixel surf to kill noobs in casual, then sorry to burst your bubble, but it's probably not gonna happen. Or is it? If you did, hypothetically, want to hover in the sky above people to sneakily rain down hell on your enemies, then I think I might have you covered. I'm bombing across on the med.
We're prepping to leave lower.
Med drop.
A week or left.
This is what's called a wallbug, and I am a very, very big fan of wallbugs.
Really deep.
What the fuck is that?
I love me a wallbug. You have no idea how many wallbug clips I have. I could fill an entire hour-long video with just wallbug clips.
I love getting on the HTTP over you.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Now's his time.
It's gonna be fed.
Oh, fucking hell.
I love it.
It's nuclear.
So let me do the honor of teaching you how to perform a wall bug. You find a wall that is Wallbug appropriate, we'll get to that part later, and you jump into it. Ideally high up the wall so that people have a harder time seeing you. As you jump into the wall, you hold W and spam A and D into it, similar to the pixel walk example from earlier. If you do it right, you should get stuck at some point. If you get stuck whilst holding A, then keep holding A. And if you get stuck while holding D, keep holding D. Because when you release your move keys, you'll start falling again. There's a sort of a rhythm to tapping your strafe keys into the wall that takes a little bit of practice. If you press your keys too fast, you're not going to react fast enough to which key you need to continue holding to stay stuck. And if you do it too slowly, you don't have that many attempts to get stuck before you fall and hit the ground. But after a bit of practice, hitting wall bugs isn't actually too hard. And you can also do wall bugs by holding S into the wall if you want to face the other way for a better view, which is how I get clips like these ones. I'm in the sky. I'm cheating. Mohammed, I'm cheating. Please don't report me to Uncle Dane though, but don't tell anyone, but I'm cheating. But how do you know which walls you can wall bug and which ones you can't? Well, it's actually really simple. Remember that bounding box from earlier? That big collision hole that every character has? Well, you see, this box never rotates, even when you do. It's always this big static rectangle that's oriented in this way, almost like it's on a grid. Walls that you're able to wall bug on are walls that are diagonal in relation to your bounding box. The corner of your bounding box pushes into the wall instead of the flat surface part. Finding these walls does take a little bit of getting used to, but generally you can just look around the map and see that most walls are angled on the grid. Then you can see the small handful of walls that clearly aren't aligned with every other wall. And the wall doesn't need to be super slanted either. Even a wall that is subtly slanted to the side like this one works just fine for hitting a wall bug. Now, the reason this works is a little bit complicated, and it involves a whole lot of maths. And maths is boring, so here's the really simple baby's first explanation of how a wall bug works. The game is constantly doing two separate checks for collision. One of them's checking that you're colliding with stuff, and the other is constantly checking if you're about to get stuck in any given object. If you use the command CL show pos 1, your coordinates will appear on the top right of your screen. If you move side to side on a flat wall, you'll notice that only one of your coordinates changes. But on these slanted walls, both coordinates change. These two numbers changing rapidly causes the stuck check and the collision check to sometimes disagree with each other. And the stuck check will incorrectly assume that you're about to get stuck, so it zeroes out all of your velocity in response to this. You're not actually stuck in the wall. The game is just sort of panicking that you might get stuck in the wall. So you hover in the air in this strange bug. But it actually gets worse than this, because this isn't the only type of wall bug. There's also coordinate wall bugs, which are caused by even more maths. These can be done on flat walls, but only if that wall is placed with coordinates that are a power of 2. Because of course, that just makes perfect sense. Something about the way computers round up and down numbers with reoccurring decimal places causes the game to get confused, and you get stuck in the wall just like a normal wall bug. These are much less common, but there is one right here on CP Metalworks. But that's not even where the story ends, because there's also Linux wall bugs, which are caused by even more maths. They work for much the same reason as coordinate wall bugs, but instead of wiggling into the wall, you have to crouch to get stuck. And also, the coordinates of the wall can't be negative, they have to be positive. And the reason they're called Linux bugs is because they only work if you're playing on a server that is hosted on Linux. Because, yeah, sure, yeah, why not? Of course, there's a Linux wall bug spot right here on Koth Bagel, thanks Tomato Tom, and there's another one on Jump Ando Bonus 2 that the Soldier World record uses right here. Jesus Christ, I just skipped a lot of maths. Now, those two other types of wall bugs are a little bit crazy, and they're a whole lot less common. But the normal wall bugs on these slanted walls are very easy to do, and very easy to find spots to do them in. But do you know what else wall bugs are good for? Avoiding fall damage. Sometimes when you enjoy rocket jumping a little bit too much, you'll end up in a situation like this. You have to do something or else you're going to die of fall damage. Wallbugs are a fantastic way to avoid dying to fall damage. But what do you do if there's no slanted wall nearby for you to fly towards? Well, luckily for you, there's actually quite a lot of ways to avoid fall damage in TF2. The most well-known of these is the Edgebug. If you fly towards the very edge of any surface, you can clip the edge of that surface without the game ever treating you as grounded. And this redirects a ton of your momentum forwards and prevents you from taking any fall damage. This is so easy to do by accident that most people who have played a Source game have probably hit at least one Edgebug at some point in their life. But the reason this works is a whole lot less well known though. It's to do with that tick system we mentioned earlier. TF2 servers check for stuff happening 66 times every second, but it's possible to have enough speed where at the start of a tick you hit the ground, but you slide slightly forwards before the next tick occurs. So at the start of the tick you're above the ground, then in the middle of the tick you hit the floor and slide off, and at the end of the tick you're still airborne. TF2 is only checking things once per tick, so since you were airborne when you started the tick and when you ended the tick, the game sort of forgets that you ever hit the ground at all, so you take 0 fall damage. But touching the floor still redirects your momentum as you might expect it to. There's also another thing called a Texturebug, which is much more precise than an Edgebug, but you're much more in control over whether you hit it or not. Where a brush ends, or where 2 brushes meet, you can perform a Texturebug, which basically just means anywhere there's an opening on a map, like this door on Badwater. Whilst you're falling, get close to the wall and hold W, but make sure to also hold either A or D. In this example, we'll hold A. Right as the top of your head passes the bottom of this brush, you tap in the opposite direction. This causes the game to get confused and zero out your velocity for a single tick, after which you just begin falling again. The reason this works is maths, but the simple answer is this. The game incorrectly assumes that you're colliding with the top part of this brush, even though you're absolutely nowhere near it. So it zeroes out your speed before realizing you didn't collide with anything and makes you continue falling. Because you're traveling downwards, the game checks for collisions on top of stuff. If you were moving upwards, it would check underneath stuff because you're moving upwards into it. So when you fall past the bottom face, it checks collisions on the brushes you're nearby, and 99% of the time it correctly realizes that you aren't gonna hit the top because you're nowhere near it. But for some reason that I don't fully understand, tapping the opposite direction in this way makes the game briefly think that you collided with the top of the brush, so it zeroes out your momentum before realizing that that didn't actually happen. And of course, the full explanation, as usual, is maths. Texturebugs are super precise to hit, but you feel way more in control of this than an Edgebug, at least in my opinion, because you're actually like pressing buttons to make it work, rather than just strafing to a lip and hoping you hit it. But both Edgebugs and Texturebugs are very precise and super easy to miss. But luckily, there's an even easier way to avoid fall damage than that. If you have enough horizontal speed while in the air, all you have to do is find a sloped surface and aim for it, and then you'll slide right up. Rampslides are super common in jump maps and in rollouts from spawn. It's a staple of rocket jumping and sticky jumping, but people sometimes don't realize you can use this to avoid fall damage as well. And the reason Rampslides work is super simple. If you have even a tiny amount of upwards velocity, the game doesn't like putting you into a grounded state. So when you're traveling really fast and you hit a slope, your move speed is redirected upwards, and your new upwards momentum prevents you from becoming grounded, so you slide right off. But there's just one more method you can use to avoid fall damage that you might not have heard of. A method that you can use literally anywhere. No slopes or walls or anything required. The one caveat is that they are incredibly precise and partially random. Meet the Jumpbug.
Yeah. Was that an Edgebug?
Jumpbugs are a weird tech in TF2 that essentially allows you to jump off the ground whilst tricking the game into thinking that you never touched the ground in the first place. You perform a jump bug by holding crouch in the air, then uncrouching and pressing jump at the exact same time the instant your feet would hit the floor from uncrouching. If you do this right, you will jump off the floor but receive no fall damage at all. This is incredibly precise to hit, and I've only hit a jump bug once in a real game scenario, and calling it a real game is pretty rich considering it was an MGE clip. The reason this works is a little bit complicated, so we're gonna get down in the weeds and get our hands dirty to explain it, you know? Let's talk about that tick system again. The game checks for collisions and stuff 66 times every second. Each of these checks is called a tick. You get the idea. But inside of every tick, the game checks for a bunch of stuff, and it checks for it in order, one at a time. And to be more specific, the game is checking for all of these things. So every 66th of a second, the game runs down this checklist in order and then goes to the next tick and does it again. This is a long list of stuff, but for a jump bug, the only parts of this list that matter are these parts here. You'll notice that handling ducking and handling jumping are done before checking for ground and zeroing out velocity if you're touching the floor. This is very important. When you perform a jump bug, you uncrouch and jump inside the exact same tick. The game checks that you uncrouched. This causes your feet to extend down and hit the floor. Then the game sees that you jumped, so it jumps off the floor. But then after all of that, it checks for the ground. It sees ground, but you just jumped, so the game concludes that you don't need to be made grounded, you need to be made airborne, which skips over all of the taking fall damage part associated with touching the ground. This is very precise to hit, much more precise than basically anything we've talked about in this entire video. But luckily, there is a way to make this easier for yourself. You can get jump bug scripts that work something like this. I hold down crouch in the air, then I tap a single button, and that single button uncrouches me and presses jump at the exact same time. This syncs up the uncrouch and jump perfectly. Now all I have to do is hit that script button within a 66th of a second of hitting the ground, which is still not easy, but it's much easier than normal. But the problem with jump bugs is that even if you're a god at hitting them, sometimes you just can't hit one, because jump bugs are partially random. Because if you're falling too fast, you miss the window to hit it. On one tick, you'll be too high up for the uncrouch to make your feet touch the floor, and on the next tick, you've already hit the ground. So jump bugs have a level of randomness to them that means that no matter how good you are, you can never hit one every single time. But despite that, they're still, you know, pretty cool. Now, avoiding fall damage is obviously useful for a class like Soldier or Demo Man, right? Classes that can propel themselves into the sky with their explosions. So maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, I main Spy, so I don't really need to know how to avoid fall damage because I'm not going that high into the air. Well, that's where you're wrong.
I got someone.
Oh! It's fucking beautiful! If you're not launching into the skybox when playing Spy, then clearly you aren't thinking big enough. This piece of tech doesn't really have a name, not one that I know of anyway. So I'm gonna take the liberty to give this its name right now, and call it the Trampoline. Or at least that's what a Dutch guy told me to call it anyway.
Hey, what's up?
The way the Trampoline works is somewhat simple. All you need is a friend and something to get stuck inside of. These one-way doors on Swiftwater are perfect for this. They only open from one side, but if you slowly move onto the other side of that door, the door will close on top of you and you get stuck inside of it. So you get your friend to play Soldier with the rocket jumper. You get them stuck in the door, and then they start shooting themselves with the rocket jumper a bunch of times. After they do that, all you have to do is jump on their head. That's a really shitty jump, but that is.
Kill a soldier, kill a soldier, kill a soldier.
Flares got him instead. The angle that you get launched off of their head is based on the angle that they aimed their rockets at. If they aimed directly downwards, you will go directly upwards. But if they aimed more forwards at an angle, you'll get launched more at the angle in the opposite direction. But this means that there's a way for you to launch into the skybox as any class, which allows me to make my dreams a reality and finally be able to Wallbug as Pootis. It might be the most useless Wallbug spot in the world though, because anyone walking through this choke can just see you without even looking up. But it's still pretty funny regardless. But you might be wondering, well, why does jumping on the stuck guy's head make you go flying anyway? Well, if you're above someone and they rocket or sticky jump up into your feet super fast, you get bounced up into the sky. This is something that can happen in normal gameplay. So when you jump on the stuck player's head, this exact same thing is happening. Because despite being stuck and completely stationary, the game thinks that the stuck player is actually moving extremely fast. Remember that list we talked about earlier of all the stuff that the game checks for inside of a single tick? Well, the very first item on this list is the reason this trick works. The game tries to get you unstuck, and if it can't do that, it skips all the way to the last 3 checks on the list. And the checks that it skips are quite important ones. Most notably for us, it skips the part where it gives you grounded movement, and it skips the part where it caps your velocity too. So despite being on the ground and not moving, you can give yourself tons of speed without moving a single inch. And this speed is uncapped too. And by having players jump on your head, you can exert that speed onto those players. But the trampoline isn't the only thing you can do whilst getting stuck. You want to see the tick perfect sandwich? Watch this.
Tick perfect sandwich.
Did you see that? Did you see that? Did you catch it? Did you catch that? That was fucking epic, no? Tick perfect sandwich. Doing this consumes the sandwich, but the game gets confused and leaves behind this spooky phantom sandwich in the process. The phantom sandwich doesn't actually do anything, but it's pretty epic if you ask me. You can also probably do this with Scout's lunchbox items too, but I couldn't be bothered to test it. If you were looking for something a little more, I don't know, useful, then you're in luck. Your flamethrower's range isn't fixed. If you're moving super fast, your flame particles from your flamethrower will adopt all of the speed that you have and move super fast too. And whilst you're flying through the air, this makes intuitive sense. But if you're stuck in a door and you give yourself a bunch of velocity, let's say with the detonator, your flame particles will gain a bunch of range despite the fact that you aren't moving at all. So you can out-snipe sniper players with your flame particles. Now, I probably shouldn't even be showing you guys this because I know some of you are going to go ruin the fun of others with it, but just a disclaimer, if you go and do this in a community server like Uncle Topia or something, you will get permanently banned. And as for doing it in casual, just be nice to people, Don't bully the children too hard, it's not fair on them. But there's one final thing you can do with getting stuck. Something that's maybe a little bit less useful, but still possible and very funny. You can do what's called a stuck launch, which is pretty self-explanatory, right? You can give yourself a bunch of velocity while stuck, and when you get unstuck, you fly off into the sunset. This one is a lot harder to do in real TF2. You can get stuck in these doors, but you have to wait for someone to come open the door before you can go flying. And even then, getting a good angle to launch at is very difficult. But there is a class who has a slightly easier time doing stuck launches. The engineer can build buildings that he himself can get stuck inside of. On jump maps, this is very easy. Walk off the ledge, see where it teleported you to, then build a sentry on top of that spot, then walk off again and you're stuck in your sentry. You then shoot rockets behind you until you're really fast, and then you move the sentry and you go zoom. But you can also do this in real games. It's just like way harder. You have to be on a payload map and you have to be on blue team. And ideally, you have a friend play medic to heal you, otherwise you just die. You build a level 3 and you carry it near the cart. You then have to place your level 3 on a turn in the cart track. Sharper turns make it easier, but you can do it anytime the cart turns. Place your gun right on the corner, something like this, and then you stand next to the cart and have it push you inside of your sentry. And you can shoot yourself a bunch of times to give yourself speed and go flying mode. This is really hard to do in a real game, but I did eventually get a clip in a real game. I'm in! Beat me? You're beating me. Keep beating me. He's about to stop my gun. Kill him, kill him, kill him.
He's dead.
Nice. How was this?
Oh, he's in.
I'm in. My gun is in front of their spawn.
Medic versus sentry gun. Boom.
It's fragging! My gun's gonna no, it dies. No. It died. Well, I got the clip. Now, was it the most exceptional clip in the world? No, it wasn't, alright? But look, I tried my hardest, okay? But this is where our journey through funny TF2 movement tech has to end. Special thanks to all of these people for helping me out with this video, especially this one named Ildbra. He has a big document that explains a ton of how TF2's movement works, and that document will be linked in the description. Because this video was by no means comprehensive. There's a ton of stuff that I didn't talk about that's definitely interesting to look into. But hey, maybe I'll save it for a future video or something, who knows. So go out there with your newfound knowledge and go do some goofy stuff in TF2 casual. And then clip it and like, I don't know, post it in my Discord server or whatever. Just try to like not bully people in casual too hard. Thanks for watching.